Welcome to episode 9 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. First of all, just right off the bat, we want to say a quick thank you to everybody that's been listening to the podcast. We're very much encouraged to continue pumping out episodes for you guys. All the positive feedback on like the Apple rating and ratings and reviews has been awesome. You guys sharing the podcast around on Instagram, et cetera, has been awesome. So thank you all very much. We have a few questions lined up for today's episode. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off by asking a question that's probably best suited for you, Jake. So the first question we have is, for a power lifter, do you ever implement isolation exercises for the prime movers, such as dumbbell chest flies, during a hypertrophy block to maximize muscle growth? Or is this too non-specific for the competition lifts?
Yes, so I definitely do, but it's clearly secondary to quote unquote more specific work. I think that when you're far away from a competition, or even if you don't compete, if you're just far away from doing some sort of test, that doing those kind of lifts, you can sort of get away with it in a sense, right? Like, we're not so concerned with just the hyper specificity of technique at that point, and we still have enough heavy work from the top sets and things like that to where we're still getting that strength practice, the skill practice, keeping the technique pretty crisp, that we can. I also kind of look at it as having fun, right? Like it gives you a chance to get away from just bench press and kind of keeps the training exciting. So I like to take advantage of that in those phases far away from a test. So I do think that we can use that, and then the non-specificity really isn't an issue at that point, because I think we're all of the opinion that ultimately a bigger muscle will be a stronger muscle. So using some of these movements that hit the muscle fibers from a different angle, you're activating some different motor units, maybe in different rep ranges, maybe just the fun and excitement lets you train harder and get more out of it, in those weeks or months where you might be doing this, things like that, right? I think that it's all ultimately a net positive, even if it's not as specific towards the bench press in particular. So that's what I think. Do you guys have any thoughts there?
The other thing I was going to say is, like, there, to a certain degree, of course, not more isn't always better, but to a certain degree, more training volume is going to get us more gains in size and strength. And while I don't think that bench press is like inherently a bad thing to perform a majority of your training volume on, I would say you probably can tolerate more if you're mixing in some other movements there that are a little bit less fatiguing. So if you can, do a good majority of your work on a bench press, but then also throw in some dumbbell flies, dumbbell bench press, stuff like that, I would assume that you could probably tolerate more total training volume. And in most cases, so long as you can tolerate and recover, that's probably going to lead to better outcomes overall. And the other thing I was going to say is just general movement variability stuff. I think there's some benefits to that. We have an article on our site that kind of talks about that a little bit from a motor learning perspective. But I also think, just like, I'm definitely not an injury person, so caveats here, but having some degree of variability in your training, I think, is probably going to prevent some type of overuse stuff if you're just hammering one exact lift all the time, which probably has some psychological components to it. Just like Jake said, if you're, just getting really bored and really burnt out doing the exact same thing over and over again, probably some benefits, just including some general variation there as well.
Yeah, so just to kind of finish off this question, I'm going to kind of explain how I like to think through this. I wouldn't necessarily say this is evidence-based, or like I can point to a handful of references for this. But I guess the way that I think about it is like, okay, if we can get 10 units of hypertrophy in the prime movers via two different routes. So let's take the squat, for example, and we're talking about hypertrophy of the quads. If we can get 10 units of hypertrophy in the quads from the main lift or a very close variation, so that's route 1. Or we can go to route 2, which is 10 units of hypertrophy from something that's less specific, maybe a leg extension. I think there's pretty good reason to believe that getting the 10 units of hypertrophy from the first route, right, the high specificity route, is probably going to transfer to the main lift better. But the crux of this is that you might, if you combine the two routes, you might be able to get 12 units of total hypertrophy, right? Like Zach said, because you can maybe tolerate more total training volume, and also the long-term psychological benefits to including some exercise variety. So I would just kind of treat it on an individual basis, right? So like some individuals, they're very, very excited to go in the gym and do high specificity every single session. If they can tolerate it and they enjoy it, and they're completing each set with intent, then I'm not super worried if we are leaning a little bit more towards specificity. But other individuals who maybe have concurrent strength and hypertrophy goals, they kind of like to train like a bodybuilder. That's somebody I might bias a little bit more towards the exercise variation route. So hopefully by kind of putting those two, that analogy of having two different routes to achieve hypertrophy, I think is helpful to conceptualize this.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask or add one thing and then ask you a question, Josh, kind of based off that. The one other thing I was going to add when we were talking about the bench press example, I kind of identify with this. For a very long time in my training career, I'd say it has changed a little bit recently, but I had a very, very poor mind muscle connection with my pecs in a bench press. I think that's another example where using some alternative tools is going to be a really, really good option. And just like Josh, we've talked about your squat 100 different times off air. Using other tools for your quads is probably going to be a much better option for you
Right.
than it would just hammering low bar squats that probably just aren't going to have a very good
Yeah.
ROI in terms of quad stimulus. But just to kind of go off, I just got my head turned a little bit as far as the specificity of hypertrophy. How far out do you think this stuff goes? So like in a common example, I've had clients ask, and I thought about for myself is like leg curls and the deadlift, for example. So like leg curls are going to be training primarily knee flexion, but the hamstring action that is going to be primarily contributing to the deadlift is going to be hip extension. How much do you think that by training that knee flexion component of the hamstrings, how much do you think that kind of has crossover? This is just kind of a general. We definitely did not prepare for this, so be warned, listeners. But I'm just curious. Kind of got me
We
thinking.
don't prepare for this podcast at all, man. It's all off.
We wrote the
it's
questions
all off.
down. That's
It's all
prep
off the
big
cuff.
time.
Yeah, so don't hold us to this too much, but I think that's a similar example to the what I was talking about with the quads, right? Leg extension versus more of a higher specificity squatting type pattern, right? Because I'm primarily thinking about the joint angles at which there is peak tension on the target muscle, but I also think that same concept applies in terms of muscles that are activated from two different joint actions, like the hamstrings. So to me, it's like there's obviously overlap. Like there's no way there isn't overlap. I don't think you could make the case that leg curls have zero transference to the deadlift. They just have limited transference. But if you can kind of top off your bucket of training stress with some of these low transference, that might be a net positive in the end, if that makes sense. I don't know if you disagree with that.
No, I genuinely haven't thought about this too much, but I just know you've thought about the regional hypertrophy stuff a lot more than I have. So I was just curious what you thought. I would say just purely off the cuff, I would totally agree. Especially if there's like some hip extension hypertrophy in quotes from the leg curls, even though it's like knee flexion dominant, that would make total sense to me. It's just like a little bit less specific in where that bias is coming from. But I guess the thing I'm really wondering about is, does like that knee flexion dominant component, does that contribute? About I don't know. We can we can move on to the next question. It's just something I'm thinking about, but I think it's a good example that kind of puts your kind of spectrum analysis of kind of how this stuff works, and kind of looking at it from two different paths. I think it's another good thought experiment to kind of understand how this stuff works from a programming perspective. So I think all in all, I totally agree with what Josh says. And from a practical perspective, that's exactly how you should look at it. It's slightly less specific, so there's probably going to be slightly less transference. But in general, a more jacked person is probably going to be a better powerlifter in the end. So even if it's a little bit less specific in terms of actually what the hypertrophy is coming from, in terms of region of the muscle or muscle action, it's probably still a net positive if you can get a little bit more jacked, and it's not compromising the more specific training that you're doing anyway. So we'll.
I just want to make something clear real quick, and potentially, at least in part, answer, I think, what you're getting at. It's not like a certain portion of your hamstring only performs hip extension and a certain separate portion of your hamstrings only performs uh, knee flexion, right? Now there might be obviously they're not one and the same, but there, I guess my point is that there's overlap. If we think about the quads, um, in a leg extension, or I should say in a squat, you don't get much rectus femoris activation. So like there are some exceptions like that, but they're not two separate entities, and even though they are different joint actions, so there is going to be overlap there. So just wanted to throw that in there in case that adds some color. Sweet. Jake, do you have anything to add? If not, you can go ahead and throw that next question out.
Just one very small thing, and that's that I think something that we've talked about multiple times before is not taking options off the table. So I think, you guys mentioned some of this stuff about potentially some injury prevention stuff or whatever. And again, we're not experts in that, but I think there could also be a place for maybe, even if you're in a strength phase, if your elbows start to bother you after a certain amount of bench press volume, but you still need more chest volume to maintain your size, right? That there could be a time and place to include these sorts of exercises even in those phases of training. Certainly not the focus and not the first choice maybe, but like we say, not taking those options off the table. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Well said.
Second question here. I'll send this one over to Zach. You like template changes, but can changing the distribution of work create noise and make it harder to figure out what exercise selection / volume is working?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I made a post about template changes, or what Josh likes to call the weekly setup. Both are totally fine options to call this concept. It's essentially just the organization of your weekly training. Are you squatting on day one? Are you squatting on day two? Where do kind of your exercise slots fall throughout the week? And you can. I made a post about how changing that up can offer some some primarily psychological benefits just from changing things up and keeping the training fresh. I think this is a perfectly posed questions because yes, I do think this creates additional noise with a ton of moving pieces by changing the template, kind of reorganizing where the slots are organized throughout the week. That definitely can add some noise to the system and make it a little bit harder to detect changes. However, I do think I only want to use this in circumstances where I know the increase in signal from changing the template is going to outweigh the increase in noise. So this isn't going to be something I'm implying every training block, every other training block. It's probably going to be, maybe once, twice at most, every other cycle or something like that. It's going to be a pretty sparing thing that I do, but it's really just something to, spice up the training a little bit, give somebody a little bit of a psychological reset, and make sure things are still fun again. And so, yes, there will be additional noise in the ability to make training evaluations based on the data provided. However, I do think the increase in psychological intent, focus, motivation to train, all that kind of stuff is going to provide a significantly greater signal from the training to allow me to still evaluate the training despite the slight increase in noise. However, I also think this question somewhat implies that you're changing other things than just the template, which very well may be true in some cases. Like you're probably going to change exercise selection to some degree, maybe some repetition ranges and stuff like that, but you definitely don't have to. You could, keep the exact same total training volume, peak intensity, average intensity, proximity to failure, all that kind of stuff, and then just simply change how your week is arranged, in which that would be, to me, just like any other isolated change in which you can see how that in isolation is affecting the training, which will provide considerably less noise. So I think, yes, the template changes is going to provide noise, but I think what this question really breaks down to is you don't want to be changing a ton of things at once if you're really trying to isolate the signal from the training that you're trying to evaluate. So making one, maybe two small changes at a time is going to be the best way to kind of organize and evaluate training over time. So what do you guys think?
No, I think that's a really good start to answering this question. I guess I would just really drive home what you said early on in your response, that yes, we might make programming decisions that reduce the signal to noise ratio. So we're increasing the amount of noise in the system, but you can consciously do that if you think the potential increase in signal will outweigh that increase in noise, right? At the end of the day, we are trying to get stronger. We're trying to see that actual signal go up over time. And if you are confident, or your conjecture is that even at the cost of slight diagnostic clarity, this is going to be better for long-term development, that might be worth it. Now, obviously, it's all a balancing act. So like, we choose to periodize things within a training cycle. So over a 12-week training cycle, we choose to make changes to the training week. That is at the cost of the signal to noise ratio. There is more noise in the system with some of these week to week changes. And by progressing someone through, a hypertrophy focus phase to a strength focus phase to a peaking phase. But that is a conscious decision, and we are willing to take that trade-off because we think there are benefits. I can totally see how somebody would come to a different conclusion than that. And I'm open to that possibility that it might not be, we might have come to the wrong conclusion, but where we stand right now is that reduction in the signal to noise ratio, right? Adding more noise to the system is indeed worth it in the long run. The next thing I'd say is, yes, template changes are going to add noise to the system. And it's important to keep in mind that when we're looking at estimated 1RMs, let's say, a top set on your competition squat, it's probably best to do that in a consistent time point in the week so that you're under consistent fatigue levels, et cetera, so that the week to week and block to block estimated 1RMs can be evaluated accurately, right? So that there's not a ton of changes week to week, and so that everything is kind of under the the same context. But it's important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, like, what is actually driving the response to training? Is it the weekly setup, or is it the overall training dose? Is it the relative proportion of things? So basically what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, I don't know if the weekly setup is actually driving the training response. So again, if you think you have to change the weekly setup in order to adjust the dose of training, in order to really drive the response and see the changes you're looking for, then that might be worth it. So Jake, Zach, what do you guys think?
Not much, man. I think that you guys covered it really, really well. I think that at the end of the day, when I think about the template or the weekly setup, whatever you want to call it, I think of it more so as just a way to organize what we're doing appropriately, right? That at least in terms of like volume and exercise selection, maybe Josh, like what you're saying, your primary squat day, you probably don't want to be moving that around all the time. But it's like at the end of the day, it's like your example hypertrophy phase, right? Your quads aren't growing because you're doing 3 sets on Monday versus 3 sets on Thursday. You know what I mean? Especially with hypertrophy, just because we know it's so much more forgiving in terms of how much load you're using and that sort of thing. So I think that I try to avoid paralysis by analysis whenever possible. And it's not that this weekly setup doesn't matter. It very much does matter. But I think that it doesn't necessarily matter for everything, right? And even some exercise selection stuff, if we're trying to address a certain technical point, maybe it's losing stability in the bottom of the squat, so we're doing some pause squats. What day you do that in the week, does that really matter for learning that stability? I don't really think so, right? So if we can change the weekly setup to fit someone's schedule better or whatever, I think it's still a very much a net positive. But like you guys are saying, like making small changes, I think is the best way to go. It's almost, I almost try to think of it as, I think a lot of people think of it this way, that your training is like a case study where we're trying to minimize confounding variables, right? So you think about in research, that's what they do. They control as much as they can, change one thing and see what happens. So that's how I like to look at it in general too, but just trying to keep in place the things that really matter, and the things that we can be more flexible about, I try not to worry about it. too much. So I just wanted to kind of get that perspective in there too, not to conflict with what you guys are saying. I agree, it's very important, but just not getting too caught up in the weeds and kind of losing the forest for the trees sometimes, that I think is very easy to do in this whole evidence-based lifting thing.
Really quick before I let you jump in here, Zach, I totally agree, Jake. And that's kind of what I was getting at in terms of saying like what's actually driving the response. Like at the end of the day, we don't have a ton of research on this, but weekly setup doesn't seem to really matter that much for hypertrophy. Like you can get away with like a pretty poor weekly distribution of a given dose of training. So like, some people might think it's ideal if you're doing 10 sets of quads per week to do it Monday, Thursday. But some research would indicate that if you do that Monday, Tuesday, you're going to see similar results. Now, would I recommend that in practice? No, definitely not. I think it's a neutral to positive effect of spreading it out appropriately. But like you were saying, hypertrophy is a pretty forgiving goal. So the weekly setup isn't really driving the response. And if the goal is hypertrophy, the weekly setup, again, isn't driving the response. It's the dose and the configuration of the training. For strength, that's a little bit different. But again, the point is the weekly setup may not be driving the response. So just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, really the only thing that I care about from maybe not the only thing, that's probably a little bit too broad of a claim, but the main thing that I'm concerned with template changes and just like kind of organizing that is really just getting people to be excited and have fun, because I think that is literally no matter what the training is, that's going to make it more effective. Mike T always talks about, if on Monday you're going to work up to a heavy top set on squats and you don't even have to look at your training log, you don't have to think about it, you come in, you start putting your shoes on and automatically assume that that's what you're going to do. I think, if you do that for long enough, that definitely starts to wear on people and you like stop having the same juice you have coming into the gym and being as excited about training and having as much focus and intent, which I think, we've talked about that in a ton of different places, how important that is. When you are really, really focused in putting in considerable effort for every single set, those few little extra pennies that you're putting in terms of having fun and putting a lot of effort into your training, I think regardless of actually what's programmed or what's on that day or whatever, I don't think that is really what I'm talking about, but just overall getting people to have fun and be excited. And part of that is aligning it with people's schedules. And so you're not having your most demanding session on a day that maybe you have a really long day at work or whatever. Like, I think just that's really what I think that dial that we're looking to turn is used for, is just to corral motivation and get people juiced up to go to the gym and lift weights. So that's kind of, I'll put a cap on that question unless anybody else has anything to add.
So is that kind of a similar concept to how we started this off, in that, yes, it is increasing the noise in the system, but if we're increasing the intent at which the lifter is executing their training, that's going to be a net positive in terms of, at the cost of a little bit of diagnostic clarity, we think that's worth it. Yeah, would that be a fair characterization?
Risk pretty much is what it is. It's just a calculated risk, and you evaluate that as a neutral positive.
I think that using that calculated risk lens and kind of the give and the take, in terms of, we want to do all we can to drive the actual signal up, right? Actually drive their strength up, whatever their training goal is, drive their the size of the target muscle up. That's the ultimate goal. And yes, we want as much diagnostic clarity as possible. And yes, maybe sacrificing some things in the short term to maximize the diagnostic clarity will get you to that individual's formula in terms of their training plan that's best for them sooner. But it's all a calculated risk of, okay, what's my best bet to get this person as strong as possible in whatever time frame, X number of years. So that calculated risk mindset, I think is a really helpful way to think about it.
Cool. All right. So we'll head over to the next question here. So I'll ask this one to Josh. I know Josh has some pretty well-formed views on this, then we can kind of kick it around. Josh, do you think that separating primary squat and deadlift days by multiple days, as opposed to doing them consecutively, for example, Monday a heavy low bar squat and Tuesday a heavy pause conventional deadlift, is absolutely necessary to manage fatigue? This person says they like the idea of doing heavier strength focused work early in the week and doing the higher volume, lower load stuff later.
Yeah, so I really like this question, largely because it's fresh on my mind. we just published an article on our website, which basically the half of the article goes over different ways to set up back-to-back training days in which the muscles you're training or the movement patterns you're training overlap. So, and one of the main points I make in that is to kind of isolate your heavy days, right? So, going into your primary squat day, you want to be as fresh as possible so that you can maximize the peak intensity on that day. Because peak intensity is probably the variable we want to really we really want to optimize for. Whereas, like Jake was saying earlier in the podcast, hypertrophy, volume allocation, that stuff is more flexible, right? If we have to reduce the load by 10 kilos for our back down sets because we're a little fatigued in our secondary or tertiary day, that's not going to make or break the training response. But if you're super wiped going into your primary squat day, where, you know, the goal is to get a high intensity, you know, a high peak intensity exposure, but you're wiped and you have to drop the load by, you know, 15, 20 kilos or more, that might be a net negative in the end. So again, one of the main points that I made in that article is really isolate your peak intensity exposures for the week. And of course, with squat and deadlift, there's some overlap there. The degree to overlap is going to be individual. Some individuals might, you know, be kind of quote unquote quad dominant in both their squat and their deadlift. So for an individual like that, there might be heavy overlap. But for another individual, maybe they're a very upright high bar squatter and their deadlift is very wide stance, very hip dominant. So there will be less overlap there. But nonetheless, there is, of course, going to be overlap between the squat and the deadlift training. So basically what this question is asking is okay, there's some overlap here. I like to do my heaviest squat day on Monday and my heaviest deadlift day on Tuesday. Is that okay? Or would it be better if I put the heavy squat day or the, you know, one of those heavy days, so maybe the heavy deadlift day, later in the week in order to manage fatigue and to ensure I'm ready to go for that heavy deadlift day? So the first thing I would say is that you can have your cake and eat it too in this example, because another point I made in the article is that strength work is generally less fatiguing than more of your high volume type work, right? So generally speaking, in the research, we see that high intensity, so a higher percentage of 1RM, lower rep type stuff will not be as fatiguing in the coming days as a high volume training session. So again, in this example, you could do your heavy squat work on Monday, as long as you keep it relatively low volume. You're not accumulating a ton of training volume, a ton of fatiguing repetitions, and then come in on Tuesday and also be ready to go for your heavy deadlift day on Tuesday. So you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. Now, the next point to keep in mind is that because we want to isolate the peak intensity exposure for the week, we want to separate, we want to put the highest volume slot that is aimed at progressing that exercise as close as soon after the heaviest exposure as possible. So to give an example of that, let's say you're squatting just 3 times a week. So maybe on Monday you have your heaviest day where you're hitting your heaviest top set for the week. And then on Wednesday you're doing your highest volume session, and on Friday it's more of like a later day, kind of like a power type session or a technique type session. It's preferable to put that high volume hypertrophy focused session as close to as soon after the high intensity day as possible, because again, that's going to be the most fatiguing one, because generally speaking, higher training volume sessions are going to be more fatiguing than the high intensity training volume sessions, the high intensity sessions. So again, the point I'm trying to make here is that there's, on one side of the coin, yes, you can do the heavy squat day followed by the heavy deadlift day, but then if you put your highest volume work for both squat and deadlift training later in the week, and then early the next week, you're trying to do your peak intensity stuff, you might run into some issues there. So hopefully with those two concepts, you can kind of come to your own conclusions. But I'll stop rambling there and let Jake or Zach jump in if you guys have any thoughts.
I was just going to add a few just things to keep in mind when discussing this question. I think overall, Josh laid out a very, very good framework of kind of the order of importance, or kind of the order of operations, if you want to go back to elementary school math. And kind of isolating that peak intensity exposure is kind of priority number one. Priority number two is to assemble your volume work around that peak intensity exposure after you've kind of organized things in a way that makes sense based on how many of those you're going to do per week. But I do think there's a couple other factors that are going to potentially influence how you're going to do this. One would be how much total training volume that you're performing. So if you only have a little bit of training volume to perform and don't have a ton of total sets, Josh, I don't know if you gave, it's honestly slipped in my mind. I was writing a note. I don't know if you gave the example of your training where you kind of generally perform like a heavy top set on a Monday on a squat, maybe one or two pretty low fatigue back off sets, and then you're going to perform a primarily your lower body training volume on that Tuesday with both squats and deadlifts. So Josh can do that in general, maybe where I couldn't, because Josh can get away with training with considerably less training volume than I can and make progress. So that is a totally reasonable setup for him, and likely is probably in line with the principles that he laid out and probably makes the most sense. Now, where this may get a little bit trickier is where you have to complete a higher amount of sets per week in order to progress your lifts. So if you have to perform, I don't know, let's just say 14 to 16 sets per squats per week, and somewhere between 10 to 12 sets per week on deadlifts, trying to do the like half amount of that training volume for each lift on one day is going to be a pretty grueling session. That's not to say that can't work. It's just to keep something in mind that maybe it's an okay trade-off in that example to allocate a little bit more of that training volume on that Monday to kind of split things up a little bit. The way I view this is kind of trying to pack as much area under the curve as we can. And so the first thing to understand is that the peak intensity exposures are going to be the primary contributor, and they're going to provide the biggest bang for our buck in terms of packing area under that curve. But from there, we also just want to make sure that we're not completely diminishing the quality of the volume work by packing too much of it into one session. Now, it's going to be different for everybody. Different things are going to seem grueling and difficult to different people. I'm sure Jake can chime in here in a second. He's probably done some 20 sets in one session at leg days in the past, where maybe that's not as difficult for him that it is for me. But I just think that's something to keep in mind, is after we have these peak intensity exposures set, we try to prioritize performance on those sessions for sure. But then from there, it's just important to consider how much total training volume is this performing, how well can they maintain quality of that volume in a given session, and just make sure that we're spreading that out appropriately and not packing all of it in one session, just to make sure that our peak intensity exposure is completely fresh. I think there is definitely advantages to doing that in a relatively unfatigued state. But remember, if we're actually going to test these things, we're going to taper training volume off, and that's where a lot of that freshness is going to come from. So you don't have to be fresh as a daisy every time you take a peak intensity exposure. We're just trying to maximize how fresh you feel for the given amount of training volume that you have to perform in a given week. Yeah, I think that's pretty much the three notes I had. I don't know what you guys think about that. Just adding some color, just to kind of wrap that with a bow. I totally agree that Josh's approach is kind of the principal approach that we want to follow when we're kind of looking to set these things up. Just keep in mind a few of the factors that I mentioned as far as total training volume and then total training volume in a session, and how that affects the quality of the overall work in a week, just to make sure that we're not sacrificing that so much, just to make sure you're walking into the gym on a day you have a high intensity set and feel like you haven't trained in 2 weeks. That's not really the intention. It's just to try to maximize things within the constraints that you're given.
Yeah, I think that maybe this can kind of tie things together a little bit. And Zach, you mentioned that some of my training has been, I don't know if illuminating is the right word, but I think that just showing the individual difference in this sort of thing, that I think it's so important to, whether you formally track it or just have a lot of conversations with people, or just paying attention, if you're coaching yourself, paying really close attention to your fatigue levels, your recovery. People are very different, right? Like you said, like for me, and that's very true, I've done a lot of training that has more volume than I would probably give a client within a certain session, right? And it really doesn't affect my top end strength too much as long as we do it, or even at all, as long as we do it intelligently. Giving it, maybe in the past I've done setups where maybe I'm training quote unquote, training legs twice per week, and I have my highest volume day, whatever, and then I have 3 or 4 days off from training those muscle groups before I do the heavier lifts, right? So, and for me, that was fine. I feel perfectly recovered. Whereas other people might still be beat up if they're doing that much volume. Obviously, the volume has to be individualized. We're not just trying to obliterate people. But I think that just that individual difference in recovery is not to be underestimated, right? Like it's amazing how much some people can just destroy themselves 3 times a week and they're perfectly fine. They just recover really quickly. Other people, they're much more, I don't want to say sensitive because that sounds negative, but you just have to pay closer attention and really manage things more closely. And that's where things like, Josh, you mentioned maybe you do like a light, quote unquote, power day that can help to facilitate some of that recovery, but still get some sort of heavy exposure in there. I think that those can be really useful in a lot of contexts. And kind of going back to that first question we talked about, maybe if, like, for me, if I'm doing whatever 20 sets in a session, I'm not doing all low bar squats, right? Like I might do a couple, 2, 3 sets, whatever, 4 sets, and then I'm doing leg press, I'm doing leg extension. You know what I mean? So we can play with that exercise selection if you need a lot of volume. And again, that individuality is very important. We're not just throwing volume for the sake of volume. If you need a lot of volume to maintain size in a strength phase or to grow, that using some of these variations that don't fatigue you as much can be really beneficial. So I think those are the 2 notes that I wrote down while you guys were talking. I think that those are important. I guess one last thing that came to mind is just sort of we don't want to go too far down that extreme, right? Like if we're trying to avoid fatigue at all costs, we're putting a cap on how hard we're training. That obviously we don't want to be super fatigued if we care about strength performance, right? But I have a hard time justifying, it's sort of like what we mentioned earlier, taking things off the table, that we just don't want to put, it's almost like being dead set on staying in a certain weight class to me, right? It just puts a cap on how much you can do. So I think that we have to accept that some fatigue is going to come with training. And that's why we save the really high volumes for hypertrophy phases, right? When we're not super concerned with that estimated 1 RM. Does it matter? Yeah, right. But it's not the be all end all of that training block. So just being okay with saying, okay, I might not feel 100% perfectly fresh every single week during my hypertrophy phase is fine. We just don't want to, like I said, losing the forest for the trees, I think is easy to do. So keeping that in mind, I think can be helpful.
Yeah. Well said, guys. I think you guys did a really good job of driving home the point that it's always a give and a take. So hopefully I kind of provided the principles and kind of the thought process of, okay, in a perfect world, we would do XYZ, right? We would isolate our peak intensity exposure. We would put our highest volume training session as soon after that highest intensity exposure within the week. So those would kind of be the principles. And we would also want to consider, okay, how much overlap is there between squat and deadlift? And just, also maximize the peak intensity of the deadlift as well and minimize any fatigue from the other exercise. But we don't live in a perfect world, obviously. So the setting up the training week is always a give and a take. Like you might just based on somebody's volume requirements, maybe you are having them take 4 bench singles per week. And they're also doing 20 to 25 sets. In addition to that, is that our starting point for most lifters? No. So I'm not going to put that in my example on the article, but that's going to be necessary, right? Because going back to earlier in the podcast, what is actually driving the response? The overall training dose and the configuration of that training dose. If you were to, pack all 25 of those sets the day after the highest intensity exposure, that's obviously not going to be a good move. So it's all a give and a take. And again, hopefully I kind of provided the principles, but when you kind of come back to reality and you think of, once you sit down and you say, okay, I want them to do X sets of squat or quad hypertrophy stuff per week, and I want their strength frequency to be 2 or 3 or whatever. Then you can kind of work backwards with the principles in mind and understand that there's always going to be a give and a take. When I sit down to kind of set up my own weekly setup or a client's weekly setup, there's always sacrifices, and there's no way to make it perfect and to check every single box. You're always going to have to make some sacrifices. You might have to take your heaviest deadlift set for the week under a little bit more fatigue than is what ideal, but you're just trying to minimize the amount of sacrifices you have to take within that weekly setup. But there's always going to be some sacrifices. So hopefully that kind of ties it up well. If you guys don't have anything to add, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Cool. All right. If you enjoyed this podcast and you think we're deserving, we would very much appreciate it if you left a rating and or a review. We very much appreciate it if you take a second to do so. Also, sharing this around like on your Instagram story or whatever other social media you have definitely helps as well. So that would be much appreciated as well. And we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.